Happy New Year and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. 2 years ago, when I founded this endeavor, I never thought we'd still be dealing with the earthquake known as COVID-19 and all of the variants. Heck, I didn't even know what COVID-19 was in January 2020. Like you, my work life has changed dramatically, and I am challenged every day to keep up with all the changes in both higher education and college athletics. Someone who has been thinking a lot about the necessary changes needed in college athletics for several years now is my guest today on the podcast, Dr. Kevin Blue, former athletics director at University of California at Davis and the former senior associate athletics director at Stanford, is now the chief sport officer of Golf Canada. Kevin has written quite a bit about the intersection of higher ed and college sports, mixing in his financial acumen and a doctorate in sports psychology. His commentary is always thought-provoking, and included in his writing have been a few case studies that challenge college administrators' thinking when confronted with difficult personnel situations. Kevin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on. It's great to talk to you today.
So I was looking at Google Maps to see where your new office is located, and you are in Oakville, Ontario, not far from Niagara Falls. There's been a lot of back and forth about how Canada and the US have managed the pandemic. As a Canadian who went to school and worked in the US, what are your observations?
It's been an interesting process, Karen, not only observing, but moving countries during the pandemic. You know, my family and I moved from Northern California back to Toronto. And it's obviously a challenging environment for everybody, but both countries are handling it a little bit differently. Canada's been a little bit more restrictive and a little more conservative, and potentially in part because of the fears about capacity in the healthcare system, and two different systems, two different cultures, and it's been fascinating to watch.
How has athletics been treated there? Are there spectators in arenas? I mean, how are they managing it overall?
Well, in fact, like our organization runs a PGA Tour event called the RBC Canadian Open and the LPGA event called the CP Women's Open, and we've had to cancel them for 2 years now, in fact, because of restrictions on not only attendance but also border crossing. So players coming from the US and around the world to Canada has been a difficult thing during the pandemic. So there's been indoors, and right now in the NBA and the NHL in Toronto, there's attendance restrictions, and people have different views on that, and hopefully we all can get back to normal as soon as possible.
I think I remember hearing the Toronto Blue Jays didn't play a home series until July or something like that.
Yeah, it was a long time. They were in Florida for a while, then in Buffalo, and then they finally got home, and we were pumped up about that to get back out to the J games, and we took that in as much as we could. But again, it's been a challenge, and we're just hopeful that we can all put this behind us at some point here.
We could not agree more. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about one of your essays. And I mentioned to you earlier that one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you is because you've been so academic, if you will, about the practitioner space of being an athletics director and where college athletics should go. And so you've written a number of essays. I've linked to them on the webpage. And one of the things you mentioned was an essay that you wrote called "Rising Expenses in College Athletics and the Nonprofit Paradox," was actually used by Big 12 Commissioner Bob Bowlesby at a U.S. Senate hearing in 2020. In this essay, you outline the systemic factors and behavioral economics that explain why spending in college athletics has been so hard to control. My audience is primarily senior leaders on college campuses. So walk us through your premise and what drove you to write it.
Sure, happy to. There's a few layers to this, Karen, but I'll start by talking a little bit about my motivation to collect those ideas. Obviously, writing is an expression of or a means to force yourself to understand a problem. And, so as a relatively young athletic director, observing what was going on and being enmeshed in the culture of college athletics, I was, like all of us, trying to figure out, okay, what's happening here and why? Like, why is spending continuing to go up, whether it's on salaries or facilities, and in many cases, for good reason, in the student athlete experience. So what's happening and why, and also like what are the factors driving the behavior? Because I think some of the criticism that comes of some of it is a little bit misplaced. I think people are eager to sort of point to the moral failings of various leadership groups or presidents and athletic directors. I think that's actually simplifying the issue in a way that's problematic. I think that, as I outlined in the article, the way that the system incentivizes investing to win, and of course the opposite is not investing and not winning, and therefore having a hard time retaining your ability to lead. The way that the system incentivizes that and does not incentivize holding costs down to make a profit, because of course you've got nonprofit organizations, like that's a systemic thing. That's a very strong environmental influence. And I think that leaders, myself included, I think others who are in positions that aren't in Power 5 leadership chairs now, that if they were in these chairs, I think they'd be just behaving in the exact same way as the people that are there, whether at the presidential level or the athletic director level. So I really want to understand, like, these are smart people that mean well, and they're not, trying to exploit athletes or hoard resources for themselves. Why is this happening? So I really tried to understand that, and once I felt like I understood it, I tried to explain it, which I'm happy to go into some of the specifics if you'd like. But I wanted to
give
start
us a
with
couple. And let me just say, I agree with you. There are a lot of good people in higher education who want to do what's best for their students, their athletes, their staff, their institutions. So we can agree that that is a definite motivation. But I agree in many ways that the system is not set up to reward that kind of behavior. So go ahead and give us some examples.
Yeah, so the basic premise, the sort of tagline of the article is about the nonprofit paradox, meaning that the nonprofit system, the organizational structure of athletic departments as nonprofit organizations, is what's really driving a lot of the spending. So if you think of a traditional nonprofit organization, such as a food bank, to oversimplify the matter, a food bank exists to accomplish a mission. And when the food bank garners resources, whether from donors or grants or whatnot, they take those resources and they use them to try to make as much impact as possible in a way that's aligned with their mission. And universities and school systems are also nonprofit organizations, and they're also mission oriented. The difference is that in college athletics, it's also a zero-sum competition, meaning that for every winner, there's also a loser, and only one team at the end of the year can win the conference championship. And by definition, if you look at college football, half the teams are going to have losing records. And by definition, there's always going to be people that are, 3-9 and their coaches on the hot seat. So the urgency and incentive to win or to not lose is different in college athletics compared to any other nonprofit industry in the United States. Like, there's no other industry in the US that includes the combination of a nonprofit structure where all money goes back into the mission, and zero-sum competition, which robustly incentivizes people to spend money to be successful. And so when you're in an environment where there's accelerating revenue, as the TV revenue has compounded over time, it's only been a natural response for leadership, whether this is presidents or athletic directors, to take this money and to use it, all of it, against their mission, which does include trying to compete successfully and trying to win. And because again, the cost of not doing that is failure, and it puts leadership in a pretty difficult position. So that explains, like, that's a very simplified version of the idea. There's no other, outside of election politics, there's no other industry or circumstance in the US where you have a nonprofit organizational structure where there's no incentive to hold your costs down to make a profit, and zero-sum competition where there's a very, very high incentive to spend as much as you can to be successful. And the combination of these two things in college athletics is what drives a lot of the spending. The same incentives do not exist in professional sports. Like, if you think about the NFL,
right,
you have the same economic dynamics as far as media revenue and the change in the media model driving an increase in rights fees. You have the same desire to generate revenue from ticket sales and sponsorships and other things. but you also have a group of owners who are interested in making an operating profit or increasing the value of their franchises, or at least not losing a lot of money. And as a result, they're eager to hold down costs, because an extra $1 million paid out to their coach is $1 million out of their pocket. And that same dynamic does not exist in college athletics, which is a nonprofit organization without any shareholders in the traditional sense. So this is like the core idea, and I think it's what explains the behavioral or the choices that are made by leadership when it comes to compensation and facility spending, et cetera. You have a high amount of pressure and, frankly, competitive imperative to spend this money. You have very little disincentive to spend it, because there's no one trying to make a profit margin. There's no dividends to pay. As long as the money's there and it's able to be spent, the incentive is to spend it all. And so what happens is whoever makes the most revenue ends up spending and investing at the highest possible level, sets the bar for everybody else, and everybody else is scrambling to try to reach that bar. And that bar just keeps going up and up and up as revenue compounds over time. So again, that's the fundamental idea. And I think that my explanation may not do it justice. I think I'd encourage people to read the paper, but it's been an idea that has hopefully helped a few people understand the dynamics of what's happening in a more complete way.
I think it's an excellent way of thinking about it. And it makes me think about the term equity. So when you have equity in your business, as NFL owners do, their franchise values grow at a remarkable 9 to 12% a year. Most of us would love to get that kind of return on our investment year in and year out. But where's the equity in college athletics to see a return on your investment? It becomes winning and losing. It becomes the Director's Cup. It becomes the ability to attract people like at Alabama, students to your campus because they want to be part of tailgating and Saturday extravaganza. So we measure equity differently. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, right? The most profit-oriented, certainly in the group of NFL owners that exist in the NFL are capitalist oriented business leaders, right? But this group of people has figured out that the most effective way to run their league is to share revenue as much as possible, restrict spending as much as they possibly can, because they recognize that zero-sum competition is going to drive them all to spend as much money as they can to try to win. And they need to limit themselves from doing that. And so it's funny, because when you talk about legislating spending caps, whether it be on coaches' salaries or facilities or whatever the case may be, and you hear perspectives that well, that would be un-American, and that's not, this is a free market. The most free market oriented group of people in the United States, one could argue, are the business leaders that own NFL teams, and they've set their league up in a way that recognizes when you mix zero-sum competition with the ability to spend a lot of money, it leads to that money being spent, and they know they drive themselves out of business if they did that. Even the large market teams, of course, have a little bit of a different view, but not that different. Like, even the big market teams recognize that the viability of the league as a whole is dependent in large part by the viability of all the teams, and as a result, the revenue sharing and the salary capping that goes on in the NFL is something that all of the owners are participating in. So it's been interesting to observe that contrast. And in college athletics, it's very unregulated, of course, other than at the moment compensation for athletes.
Correct. And I would argue too that the NFL owners have another thing in their back pocket, which is who pays for how much of their stadiums, right? Because the stadiums end up generating enormous amounts of revenue for them. If they can get the state or the local governments to pay a third or half or 3/4 or even all of the stadium, they can make that much more money.
Yeah, that's a separate issue that's also complicated.
Well, you bring up some good points. So let's talk a little bit about this facilities arms race. It's such a catchphrase in college athletics, but I've spoken with folks who work at the Pac-12 and work on Big Ten campuses, And the pressure that's on now to build single sport facilities is very rare, very real, and very expensive. On many campuses, other construction has been delayed or halted due to the pandemic, but that has not seemed to deter the facilities arms race in athletics. In fact, George Kliavkoff, the new Pac-12 commissioner, said last week he was going to remind the presidents at every meeting this year of the importance of investing in their football programs coming off of an 0-5 bowl season record. You were a golfer at Stanford and a senior administrator. And in 2020, Stanford dropped and then added back 11 Olympic sports. Talk with us about this paradox for a Power Five conference trying to keep up. It seems kind of crazy.
Yeah, well, again, the bar for spending and the bar for investment is set by those who make the most revenue, because there's no incentive to take the revenue that you make and take it as profit margin and pay it out to your owners, because there are no owners in college sports. So in the leagues right now, in the SEC and the Big Ten, there is some degree of separation in terms of revenue that's being generated by those leagues, and there's forecasts for even more separation when considering the dynamics of the media environment. And so the challenge that the Pac-12 has is that in an unregulated environment where people can spend all the money that they make, the Pac-12 is going to not be able to organically generate the revenue that those other leagues are, and therefore they're not going to have as much resource available to spend. And if you could look at this purely from a theoretical standpoint, the best thing that the Pac-12 could do to become more competitive is actually to lobby for overall national limits on what people could spend. They're not, the Pac-12, and just the nature of how media and fan support works in the United States, the Pac-12 is not going to be able to generate revenue, sustainably generate revenue at the level that the SEC and the Big Ten will. So in order to level the playing field, the Pac-12 is better off trying to find a way to cap the top end rather than just continuing to pursue the growth rates that they're seeing in the SEC and the Big Ten, which are not, the Pac-12 most likely will, absent any like pretty outside the box arrangement in their next media contract, probably will not be able to sustainably grow at the pace of those other two leagues. I think that the commissioner's comments, I understand them. It's a very rational thing to do to make sure that he's communicating with the fan base. He's communicating with the coaches, by making those comments publicly. I'm not sure if I was a president on a campus and I saw those comments, I'd feel great about sort of how they positioned myself and my school. I also think that it ignores the reality that, half the teams are going to lose half the games, or half the teams are going to lose and half the teams are going to win. So if every single Pac-12 school is making the same level of investment, half of that money is going to be wasted by definition. But again, that's the reality is, like, given the unregulated environment and given how important popularity is as a currency for leadership in higher education, I understand what the commissioner is doing and why.
It's a good point. I hadn't thought about the issue of staying in power and retaining your popularity and feel like you're a man of the people, so to speak, in that situation. We saw a lot of schools really talk up the deficits that they were incurring because of the pandemic. And it seemed like many of them reverted to cutting sports. I mean, what are your thoughts about that for these big land grant institutions? Should they be cutting sports?
Again, it's the same. It goes back to the same type of explanation, right? Nobody wants to cut sports. The leadership that are involved on these campuses do not want to cut sports. But when they're left with a choice of invest more in the sports that create the highest return for the campus, which in many cases is, football and men's basketball, and to a degree women's basketball, it's either become less relevant in those sports, or invest more institutional money to continue to allow the budget to grow at the rate of the growth of competitors, or it's reduce non-revenue producing sports. Those are tough choices to make.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to make those choices. And there's not a bunch of presidents and athletic directors out there just eager to cut sports and pump all the money into football. It's not something that people set out to do in in their careers. But absent any way to regulate the spending, the choices are very, very difficult. Clearly, places like that you've mentioned, Stanford, who has since reversed, and other places that have reduced sports, strictly speaking, have the money to fund the sports that they otherwise would have cut. But that's not the decision that people are making, right? They're making the decision, can I fund the sports where the rate of spending is accelerating? Can I continue to fund those sports at a level that makes me competitive or not? And again, and the challenge is a lack of regulating that is just it keeps putting more and more pressure, on those situations.
Many folks have said the answer to this is an antitrust exemption in terms of capping salaries or spending. What are your thoughts on that?
I've argued, or at least presented a theoretical basis for why capping spending, I think, is the right, again, theoretical approach to solving the problems. A spending cap does a few things. It removes the incentive. Right now, every incremental dollar, every marginal dollar that's generated matters. So if a high revenue program makes another $1 million, that's another $1 million they can spend to extend their resource advantage over somebody else. And for a low or mid revenue program to make another $1 million, that's material because it helps close a gap. If you had a ceiling on what you could spend, then there would also be a ceiling on how much money it mattered to generate. And as a result, you would see schools be able to make different choices about what trade-offs they're making in order to generate revenue. You wouldn't have to raise ticket prices or donation levels as aggressively, because you wouldn't have to pursue the revenue because you couldn't spend it anyway. You wouldn't have to do TV deals that had people playing, basketball games at 9:00 on a Tuesday night. You wouldn't have to do TV deals in the case of some football conferences where you're playing Friday nights and short weeks and late night travel, because again, the utility of that money would be diminished the closer you got to the spending cap. So there's other benefits in addition to leveling the playing field and controlling the absolute amount of spending that's happening in athletics. The very presence of a ceiling creates other follow-on benefits that hopefully help improve the system and have some positive spillover effects. As far as the legality of a cap, that's, you have to ask others about that have some more a better legal ability to determine if such a cap would be per se legal or subject to some kind of rule of reason analysis. I think, again, based on from a theoretical perspective, it seems to me that the uniqueness of the college athletics financial environment, where you have this unique combination of nonprofit organizations engaged in zero-sum competition, that's not really a free market. It's not really a free market in the same sense of you have for-profit businesses competing against each other, and that might create a window for some different treatment through a rule of reason analysis. But again, that's far beyond the scope of my expertise, and probably something that other people are best prepared to answer.
Well, you've done a pretty good job, at least helping the average person understand what the challenges are. I think innately people know that the spending rate is just unsustainable. So what do we do? And you're trying to offer some solutions. Let's shift gears for a second and talk about those mid-major schools and how one of the ways they try to keep up is using institutional funds that could go to academics or campus recreation or student activities. And they also rely on student fees. I know you've worked in that environment. Tell me about the dynamics of using student fees for a Division I program.
Yeah, so first of all, I believe that varsity athletics and intercollegiate athletics has intrinsic value that is worth universities investing in. And, at the Power 5 level, the commercial environment is such that they're able to generate enough revenue to make their programs largely self-sustaining in some cases, in many cases not, but reasonably there's enough revenue coming in to make them self-sustainable in some cases. But if you look at the mid and low major levels of Division One, there is not a substantial amount of athletics specific revenue being generated. There are often spillover effects for fundraising and other things, but intrinsically there's not revenue coming in that can sustain the overall operation. But I also believe that that's okay, right? There's many programs on campus where you have various academic departments that may not be justified from a traditional profit and loss sense, but that's what we do in higher education, and that's okay.
That's right.
I think that there's asking questions about the amount of institutional support or student fee support, and the whether or not that student fee or institutional support could be directed to other areas. I think that's also part of a reasonable on-campus dialogue about some of these financial issues. And I'm aware of that being the case in several instances in the last several years. And I think that campuses and students have the right to have discussions about the use and opportunity costs of institutional funding and student fees.
Yeah, and even in the last couple of years, you've seen some schools that have gone up to as much as $2,000 a year for every student who's a full-time student on campus, undergraduate. And then, see students complaining, look, I never attended any sporting events. I don't care about sporting events, but I'm going to end up having $8,000 of my bill paid towards this. And it's a hard thing. So there's some referendums on some campuses that say, let us opt in or opt out of these student fees. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that the differences in how the accounting works at public schools and private schools, and some schools disclose basically on a line-by-line basis how some of these fees are used for extracurricular activities, whereas other schools do not. So I think it's a little bit tricky to disentangle. Like in a private school environment, in largely there's not as much transparency around, here's the tuition amount that you're paying, and certainly some of that tuition revenue is going to pay for athletics. Certainly some of it's going to pay for, some social science program or some engineering program, et cetera. It's not enumerated in as much clarity as maybe the case is in public schools. I do believe that students where there are fees assessed certainly have the right to express whether or not they feel that the amount of money being spent by the students through these fees is appropriate. And in the case of the place where I last worked at UC Davis, like there was a process in place for them to do that every single year. And so we did engage the students in those in that dialogue every single year, and that's appropriate. We're in an era right now where the student loan debt, as everybody knows, has become a topic that is being well understood by the public, and so it does put increased appropriate amounts of attention on the cost of higher education and all the things that contribute to those costs. I do believe should be scrutinized as well. And I think in most cases around the country, there are good processes in place for that to be evaluated and assessed.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I do think the general public is much more aware of the cost of going to college these days, and so they do scrutinize many of the lines on the tuition bill. My last question to you is this. Most of my listeners are senior campus leaders, folks who currently oversee athletics. Maybe one day they're going to move into a position where they would provide oversight for the athletics director and the athletics department, or in fact, they're college presidents. What would you tell them about providing good leadership and oversight to the athletic director and the athletes? And can you give us one or two examples of perhaps good or poor leadership situations? And this
it's interesting. As I came from a larger research, Stanford, where I worked prior to UC Davis, has a lot going on, athletics was overseen there by the provost, and at UC Davis, it's overseen by the chancellor. And in both cases, the leadership, I had very positive experiences with leadership. There's the appropriate amount of engagement. There's the appropriate amount of support being provided, both in symbolic ways like attending events, and also in important tangible ways. In some cases, it's financial. In other cases, it's just making sure that there's an appropriate dialogue about athletics happening with the right people on campus. Chancellor May at UC Davis was exceptional at communicating with student athletes, making sure that student athletes understood how well supported they were by the university. And, I think that goes a really long way with coaches and with student athletes. I think that it's one of the things that I've observed that's been interesting for me is presidents and chancellors have a lot going on. And I always wondered about what's the amount of time per day that they should be spending on athletics. And it was my job as the athletic director to try to make sure that they felt good about athletics and everything was in order, so they could spend their time working on things that around the university that are maybe more important. There's a lot of things that research universities do every day to contribute to society in very important ways. And so my goal was to make sure athletics was functioning in an optimal way in order to free my bosses up for other things. So it's I'm sure it'll be an adventure for whomever assumes leadership role over athletics. Great communication, just as is the case in most leadership positions, is really the key to I think a successful engagement with the athletic department.
Could not agree more. Kevin Blue, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. You've given us a lot to think about in terms of where we go with spending and how we can manage it so that more schools can still be competitive. And I really appreciate it and wish you the best of luck in your new position back with your original sport, which is golf, which is very cool.
Thank you, Karen. I appreciate the opportunity to be on.
Absolutely.